Hello, and welcome to the latest of our podcasts into the cost of living. And today we've got Sue joining us to talk a little bit more about our new paycheck disposable update that reflects the changes that we've seen. So this is our first podcast since the latest budget, and what we've done is we've produced a new version of our disposable income product that takes into account the changes as a result of that budget, but also that we've seen over the year in terms of inflation and general rising costs. So, without further ado, Sue, over to you. What's the overall picture that we've seen in this new version?
So thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. I suppose the overall thing to make point to make in the first place is that we've decided to compare this paycheck disposable income to the one that we ran last year, last budget year. Those of you who've used our product or been to one of these before will know we did an interim update in October when the world was going slightly crazy in the UK. And at that point, we didn't think things were going to go so well for us, but things have calmed down a little bit. So it makes more sense if we're looking at households and how they're performing, how they're coping, to do a year-on-year comparison. So that's what we've done. Over that period, what we are seeing is that households overall have lost 2% of their disposable income. So by which we mean last year they would have had 42% of their income left over and disposable to use as they wish. Now it's 40% from an overall picture. It is worth noting, though, this is the influences upon the household. Inflation rate means that their spending power is less than that. We're talking about what money is coming out versus what money is coming in versus what's going out. So that's what we see. That's our overall.
Okay, so to clarify, so things have dropped by 2%, but then we've got inflation at 10% on top of that, so that pocket full of money goes even less.
Buys you less.
Okay, right. So can you break that down a bit into the different sort of components that you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's worth doing a little bit of a breakdown as to how paycheck works. So the first thing is that we are looking at overall averages by postcode. So we apply it at a household level, but it's at postcode averages. So there will be some nuance that is lost for different audiences, but it gives a good relative scale picture. And there's three big areas within it. So there are the things that you spend money on that you have no choice over. So your tax, your income tax and your national insurance. You don't get to choose how much you pay on that. It gets taken at source, and I'm sorry, you're not allowed to not pay that. So that's a given. Then there are things that are pegged to longer term decisions, so they're less easy to change quickly. So things like mortgages, rent, utilities, council tax, things like that tend to be pegged to your house value. So you can change them, but it's difficult to change them quickly. Then you have the things that you can make different decisions around. So you do need food, you have to eat. You do need clothes because we like people in society to go out wearing clothes. But how much you spend on them is within your gift. So there's things like that where you can choose how much you spend. But there are also things like childcare or travel to work where you may be able to find alternative arrangements. So what we do is look at those three big areas to see, right, what is the environment doing to impact what money you have to spend in those areas, be that through choice or not.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you, Sue. Obviously, we have to talk about this data through the prism of affluence, especially when we're talking about disposable incomes, which we know obviously vary enormously across the UK. So where are we seeing some of those biggest impacts of specific user groups and consumer groups?
Yeah, I mean, you are seeing marked groups that have had a different impact from the budget, basically, and from the changes in interest rates over the last year. There's been 11 interest rate changes in the last year, which we kind of noticed as we went along. But when you count up over the course of a year, that's a lot. So it's our middle groups that are being hit the most. So successful suburbs and steady neighbourhoods. So they're proportionally, they are being hit the most in terms of housing costs, but they also have the most to play with. So they are least squeezed anyway. But the big things are, the impacts on them are mortgage rates and also some freezing of income tax brackets that came in with this budget. So they are seeing the most proportional change from a negative perspective. It's worth saying there aren't any real winners. Everybody has less cash available to them. But in terms of a protective effect, it does seem that the government's policy on increasing rebates to those most vulnerable households is having some benefit. to them. So whilst they're not necessarily better off, it seems that they have gone down slightly less, particularly when a bigger proportion of their overall spend is on utilities than in some of our Acorn groups. So biggest hit on the middle in terms of household costs, and then biggest protection at the bottom in terms of utility energy rebates.
Okay, that's really interesting. Was there anything in the data that particularly surprised you?
Yes, and possibly a function of living in London and working with many young people, because what we're seeing is that private rents are, on average, they're only going up at around 5%, and so that's private rents, and social renting is not dissimilar to that figure. But I think it is fair to say there'll be a huge amount of regional and pocket changes, variety around that. So I think we're going to see some sort of time lag as to when people renew their rents. So if you're already in agreement, that's not going to change particularly. And there are certain pockets within London where it'll be much spikier than that. There'll be much higher rates than that. So we're looking at overall regional averages of around 5%. In those, it is undoubtedly, again, the rising prosperity, the younger city sophisticates, career climbers, student life will be the groups that feel that private rental rise the most, not just the proportional change, which isn't massive relative to the other groups, but it's such a big proportion of their overall income and their overall spend that they'll feel it much more keenly, and it gives them far less for other things. And then the social rents are having a disproportionate effect on those in urban adversity, so particularly younger hardship families, again, because it is such a high proportion of their overall income. So we expect that next year, when we look at these, we'll see those rates rise more as the lag effect kicks in. But we're not seeing it yet. It is also worth saying, we have a scenario tool that we can apply those kind of changes to, so that organisations can see what they think it might be if we think that's looking a little bit low for what they might expect in certain regions.
Okay, that's fantastic. So yes, that scenario tool that we've shown, and we had to do quite a lot of scenarios on last year as things moved so quickly, that still is in existence, is it?
It absolutely is. Yep.
Okay.
Always have to run a scenario.
Okay, and in terms of, I know CACI typically update things on an annual basis. Am I correct that, assuming that we don't have the Richter cell shocks of last year, we're going to go back to that annual update cycle?
Absolutely, and there's a reason for that. It is because the big changes in overall household income and spend tends to be an annual budget review. So for all of those childcare costs and impacts on tax and those kind of things. So unless we see huge changes in interest rates, it is likely that we will go back to a annual cycle because it gives a smoother picture of what's happening anyway.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, any other fascinating insights that you found in this year's version?
So I think the only other one that is worthy of note is what we're spending on food. So it is without a doubt up as an absolute, but also as an overall proportion of spend. So we are shifting more of our spend into food. What we're seeing is both basket sizes going up, but also the inflationary effect going up. So there may be some of that is a fall out of COVID, because we all learned that we wanted to cook all the time and we were amazing at feeding ourselves. That may shift back to be more balanced. But at the minute, we are seeing a huge increase in both the absolute amount and the proportion of our incomes that we're spending on food.
It's really interesting that you start to mention grocery. I've been doing a little bit of research in the background on kind of how inflation's tracking this year. Obviously, we presented a lot about that at the end of last year. Now, energy and the housing bills really were the kind of the main topic of discussion, particularly in the press, for the cost of living this last year. Looking at the way that grocery inflation is increasing, and it's increasing much quicker than any other kind of category that we spend our money on, it's very likely that grocery may be the villain of the year. I mean, we're tracking 18% inflation in March 2023, which is pretty staggering. And I think we will all kind of see that when we go into our local shop and we're hit with how much it costs at the end, and it's so much bigger than what it used to be. Now, I did a bit of digging into our product brand dimensions, which obviously Rachel talked about before. And what we've seen is actually consumers really reacting back to that and trying to save money where they can. So, for example, Tesco Express and Sainsbury's Local have actually dropped in market share this quarter. but Tesco's and Sainsbury's, the big kind of supermarket formats, have grown. So people kind of really recognizing that actually the cost of their goods are going to be a little bit cheaper if possibly they walk a little bit further and go to those bigger options. And of course, this I don't think will surprise anyone, but Aldi and Lidl both growing their market share this quarter again by 1.3% and 0.8% respectively. So people are really making a kind of concerted effort to save on that food shop where they can, because they'll be noticing that significant price increase. The other interesting one I just wanted to finish on was around restaurants, pubs and bars. Now, we obviously saw and we talked about dips and engagement with those types of things last summer. Actually, what we're seeing this quarter, so tracking through January and February, is that spend has held its own actually, and it hasn't fallen away in the way that other categories have. So people are still going out, people are still going to have a drink or go for a meal with their friends or family or whatever, and we haven't necessarily seen that fall away. So I think it's going to be a really interesting couple of months. Obviously, we're just about to go into May. We've got 3 bank holidays this month, including the coronation. So there is huge potential for people to spend lots of money on the socialising and that social element. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see whether consumers end up doing that or whether they decide to save their money and prioritise their spend elsewhere. So yeah, lots to come, I think.
Okay, fantastic. And yeah, so let's wrap up there. So firstly, thanks, Sue, for coming along and sharing with us the latest on paycheck disposable income. So am I right that that is now available for our clients?
It most certainly is. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And yeah, picking up on what Hannah just talked about there, this and what both of you talked about there around this rising food spend. As a result of that, we're actually going to do our next podcast. It's going to be a bit of a deep dive into the grocery sector. We've got our colleague Louise Etherden going to come and talk particularly through that sector through the lens of our brand dimensions data. And then just a bit of an advance warning, the session after that, we've all got to start to reprogram ourselves, because we're going to be joined by James Debenham, and we're going to be talking about what the new lens of using our new version of Acorn. So watch this space for more of that. That's our next couple of months worth of material. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Paul.